Good morning. My name is Ana Quadros Gomes from Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, and today I have the honor to present Louise McNally from Universidad Pompeu Fabra, Spain. First of all, I'd like to take a moment to congratulate Miguel Oliveira Jr. and Raquel Freitag for the organization of Abralin ao Vivo Linguistics Online. It's an initiative of Abralin, Associação Brasileira de Linguística, in cooperation with many international linguistics organizations like Associação de Linguística e Filologia da América Latina, Linguistic Society of America, British Association for Applied Linguistics, and Sociedade Espanhola de Linguística, among others. In the pandemic scenario, getting together like this is very precious. Louise McNally needs no introduction. Anyway, I will mention some of her many achievements. At Universidade Pompeu Fabra, besides teaching and researching, she has occupied several governance positions. She is currently co-editor-in-chief of the open access journal Semantics and Pragmatics, and a advisory board member of the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Linguistics. Until the end of 2015, she was an associated editor of Natural Language and Linguistic Theory. Up to 2019, she was a co-editor of the Studies in Linguistics and Philosophy series. She has received many awards in recognition of her work, among them the Catalan Institution for Research and Advanced Studies Academic Award in 2009 and 2014. In 2018, she has received the Humboldt Research Award, granted in recognition of her entire research career while encouraging international scientific cooperation. Louise McNally has also been elected a member of the Linguistic and Language Science section of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the world's largest scientific organization for the period 2016-2019. Her research concerns natural language interpretation, mainly within formal semantics tradition. Her numerous articles cover a range of semantic phenomena. Some of them are gradability, existential sentences, idioms, strong and weak nominals, and modification. Well, without any further delay, let us listen to Louise McNally, who will be giving a talk entitled Meaning for Others and for Ourselves.
Okay, thank you very, very much for that kind introduction. I'll start sharing my slides right now. Let me see if I can do this. Let me go back to Zoom. While I'm doing this, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the organizers of Abralin for this opportunity, which Yeah, so I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the organizers for this opportunity to speak. The Abralin series is extremely impressive, and I'd like to congratulate you on the number of talks, the variety of talks. It's definitely made this difficult period more supportable. And my goal in this talk is really just to get you interested in an idea and to take it seriously. So I will not try to convince you that the idea is right. I cannot offer a detailed explanation of it. I just want you to walk away with this particular idea. And the starting point actually is another Abralin talk, which was given a few months ago by Barbara Partee. And in the question period of the talk, she made the following comment. She said, "I hope the next generation will figure out how to take the good approaches to lexical semantics and the good approaches to compositional semantics and figure out how to look at the lexical meanings in a way that will be compatible with a good way of looking at compositional meanings." And this, I think, is a wonderful challenge. It's one that I've been working on for the better part of my career, first and mainly from sort of the perspective, let's call it, of formal semantics, but in the last 10 years or so, to a lesser extent, in collaboration with people who work in computational lexical semantics. And I have to say, very often I was left feeling frustrated when I tried to work on this problem. And in the last couple of years, I've been thinking more deeply about how to approach it to make it a bit less frustrating. And so what I want to talk about is how I've come to do that. And my approach is going to kind of take a higher level view of the problem, starting from the very, very basic question of what and who is natural language meaning for. So I want to get a little bit above the level of the juxtaposition of lexical and compositional semantics, and to try to situate things in a broader perspective. And that's, in a sense, where the title for this talk comes from: meaning for others and for ourselves. So let me start by saying a bit about that title. So meaning for ourselves. Natural language allows us to do many things. I cannot talk about all of them, and I certainly don't mean to consider the ones that I don't talk about as any less important than what I will focus on. Natural language allows us to identify and categorize things in the world and the relations between things we find in the world. It also allows us to structure our experience so that we can remember our experiences and recognize other ones that we find subsequently as similar. So in other words, natural language hugely facilitates thought. This is what I mean by meaning for ourselves. It's how we build our cognitive furniture to a large extent. But meaning is also for others. The meaning we make for ourselves gains a huge added value by being accessible to others. And the question is how to make it accessible. And the answer, I think, that natural language offers us is an easy, reliable, and robust way to make connections between our thoughts, our categories, our experiences, and our shared environment. And I should just say as a kind of initial caveat that I don't here take any kind of position as to whether meaning for ourselves is logically prior to meaning for others or vice versa, or in the history of the development of language, whether one was prior to the other is not really important to me. What's important is that the two coexist and feed off of each other. All right. So more specifically, the idea that I want you to be interested in is the following: that natural language provides distinct but integrated systems for constructing meaning. On the one hand, productively combinable expressions that support creative category formation. All right. This is stuff that people have known about forever. So everybody knows we have ways to form complex content words, to form new words. We have blends, we have compounding, we have morphology. I call this content words plus as a kind of abbreviation, even though things are a bit more complicated than that. Just to give an example from last week's New York Times, so America is ready to quarantine. So the person who came up with that word, how did they do it? A theory of natural language meaning should say something about this. They formed a kind of complex category, a complex concept out of the quarantine that we were in or still are in some places, and the idea that you look for ways to cheat on that. We also, of course, have productively combinable expressions that support connections to and between things in the world. This is what, let's say, linguistic semantics has mostly focused on. It's the stuff that we tend to associate with grammar, right? And you can see this very easily by looking at sort of Jabberwocky talk, or if you take a piece of text and you remove the content words and substitute anything in them, you can still make out some kinds of information: who, how many participants there might be, some general features of a situation if it involves a change, a movement, locations, causal relations, and so forth. Okay, and I think what maybe is a little bit different in the perspective, this idea that I'm trying to get you interested in, is that the two systems are somewhat independent of each other. They both involve combinatorics. And then, of course, they have to be integrated, right? And if this seems a little bit opaque to you, I think an easy way to see it is to contrast human language, which I think is special in this way, with other human communication systems that have only one or the other of these systems. So to give you an example of a case where there are productively combinable open class
Louise,
expressions. Yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt. It seems that your slides are not going on. They are in the first page.
Oh, I don't understand why that is. Let me see. Should I pause? I'm advancing in the, so what should I do? Stop the sharing?
Well, I will ask.
Louise, can you try to stop the share and try again?
Yes.
Thank you.
So should I try? Let me try this again. I'm sorry that this is the case. What do you see now?
Now it's in full screen. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
And do you see a slide that has a picture with emojis on it?
Yes, we can see you moving your mouse now. Yeah, it's fine.
And if but then what happens is I cannot move the PDF.
You can you try to click on it with the mouse?
Ah, yes. This works. Okay. So then I will continue now. I think nothing terribly important has been lost yet. Yeah?
I'm sorry?
So I can continue now.
Yeah, you can.
Okay.
And I think that you can use the keyboards now if you want, or just the mouse, whatever you prefer.
Okay. So then I will continue. So on the one hand, so I was talking about the fact that we have other kinds of human communication systems which are not natural language that have only one of these systems or the other. So an example of productively combinable open class expressions without grammar, I would argue, is what we find with emoji. So people use emoji now to tell stories, to try to recreate poetry, pieces of literature, and so forth. You see an example here of Les Misérables. And clearly it's possible to try to put together some kind of meaning out of this, but it's not nearly at the level of detail that one can extract from a natural language description. Right. Similarly, we have, I would say, human communication systems that have grammar, but lack the rich open class system that human language has. Music could be an example. So the grammar of music has been studied quite widely by Ray Jackendoff, Lerdahl, and others. It has a grammar, it's very expressive, but it doesn't afford us the same kind of categorization potential that human language does. All right. So this is, in a sense, putting these two things together. This is the thing that makes human language special, but I want to emphasize the fact that you have combinatorics on both sides. The types of signals are different. Do you see my slides now continuing? Let me just check.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so specifically then, if you want, we can concretize Barbara Partey's hope and try to have a theory of natural language meaning that accounts for the following. For the productive open class system, we can think of this as rich lexical semantics in co-composition, if you're familiar with this term from James Pustiowski. The productive system for establishing meaning relations to things in the world. This is what referential semantics has given us. And crucially, the integration of these two things. And in the rest of this talk, my goals are very, very limited. What I want to do first is talk about some of the data that convinced me that we should treat lexical semantics in composition and referential semantics as distinct but integrated. So I'm going to advocate what I call a non-uniform theory of meaning. Then I'm going to talk about some of the things that I have found in very diverse literature that point to this kind of theory of meaning, things that I would not have connected or even understood if I had not thought about meaning as being potentially non-uniform, combinatoric in its different pieces, and integrated. I'll do that towards the end. And then to try to help make this idea more generally that may be more accessible, I'm going to try to situate natural language meaning in a broader semiotic perspective. Okay, so what is the data? The data is figurative verb polysemy. This is data that I started to think about thanks to a former student of mine, Alexandra Spalek, and we continue to work on this data. She started by writing her thesis on figurative verb polysemy in Spanish, and as she continued to work with Spanish, I started to think about English, and we saw very interesting similarities and differences. And so I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about some of these similarities and differences. Unfortunately, I don't have time to give you a full analysis of them, which would be really the promise that would make the idea that you have techniques for productive co-composition of especially lexical meaning really viable. Those do exist. I think you can find them in computational semantics, but I want to give you a flavor for what the problem is. All right, so here's an example. I'm going to focus on just one pair of verbs, barrer in Spanish and sweep. We've looked at other pairs of verbs, but in the interest of time, I think one is enough. So barrer can be used as a transitive verb, as you see here. Pachi barrió el suelo. And in English, you would say Pachi swept the floor. I've put this in blue because I want to emphasize the fact that the direct object here is the location that is swept. All right. This use, both in English and in Spanish, has a figurative counterpart. Actually, it has quite a few. Just to give one example, you can use this verb with a location argument to describe a kind of searching. So here's an example from the Corpus del Español. All of the longer examples are taken from corpora. I won't identify each corpus in detail, but I've put glosses there. So for example, intenté pillar la cometa, pero no tuve éxito a pesar de barrer el horizonte oeste una y otra vez. So in English, this would be, I tried to catch the comet, but I wasn't successful despite sweeping the horizon for it over and over again. Okay, so something similar, right? Barrer also has a transitive use in which the direct object is the thing that is picked up, the locatum. This use is exemplified by Pachi barrió las migas. In English, you cannot use simple transitive sweep this way. You have to say Pachi swept away or swept up the crumbs. There's a bit of difference in grammar. But the point is that, again, you have a similar figurative use of both verbs. So to describe, for example, removal in general, Michelle barrió las críticas de un plumazo. So Michelle swept away the criticisms with a stroke of her pen. Okay, so we could have a whole conversation about what it is to be a figurative versus non-figurative meaning. If you have questions about that, I'm happy to answer later on, but let's just take for granted now that there is something different about these uses from the, imagining the broom. Now, verb polysemy, I think, offers a unique, it's a bit complex, but a unique window into the way form and meaning are related in natural language. And what we have seen, Alexandra and I, is on the one hand that part of the signal tracks the general basis for event categorization, and figurative language use is about placing into a similar kind of category what could otherwise be considered rather different kinds of events. This part is done by what you could call, or some people call, the idiosyncratic root meaning of the verb. Another part of this signal in verb polysemy specifically tracks event reference. This part is what people sometimes associate with morphosyntactically encoded event structure or argument structure. Okay. And the fact that these two work a bit independently of each other is very visible when you start to look at polysemy patterns across languages. So this comparative perspective is very important. So we're going to look now at some additional similarities between these two verbs, and then we're going to look at some differences. So as I said, and as we've seen, these two verbs, sweep and barrer, have similar figurative uses, setting aside these small grammatical details involving the particle in English. And if you take, for example, Adele Goldberg's claim about verb meaning, that verbs contribute a semantic frame of predication, She says a generalized, possibly complex state or event that constitutes a cultural unit. If we think that this is what each of these verbs is associated with, and if this is the same, then if there are enough similarities between the cultures where Spanish is spoken and the cultures where English is spoken, we might expect then people to make similar sorts of analogies. It's not required, but shouldn't be surprising. And indeed, in the IDS database, which is a very large lexical sort of concept database developed by Ritchie and Comrie, you see that sweep and barrer are classified together under the same concept code, okay, under basic actions and technology. So, we can be sort of unsurprised that there are these similarities. But there are also very interesting differences in figurative polysemy between sweep and barrer. And we argue that this is also unsurprising if you take as a given that these two verbs have been argued independently to encode or to be associated with different kinds of event structures. Right? And specifically, it's been argued for a long time, first by Levine and Rappaport-Hovav, that sweep is essentially a manner of surface contact through motion verb. Right? It does not by itself require there to be any change, any removal, or anything like that. Whereas for barrer, there's a fair degree of consensus in the Spanish literature that this verb describes what they call an actividad resultado. It's been described very specifically as a verb of displacement in a recent thesis by Eugenio Recuerdo. So this is a very basic difference between the two verbs. Sweep, of course, can appear in constructions, resultative constructions that allow it to express in a larger verb phrase a result, but the verb by itself does not do that according to Levine and Rappaport-Hovav, whereas barrer does do that, or at least if removal is not entailed, it's certainly considered to be an intended result of the activity. Okay, so this difference is going to be very important. Now we're going to look at some additional figurative uses to help us prepare for the differences. So, for example, the two verbs are used with location arguments, and again, you see the blue to signal that, to describe certain kinds of weather, especially winds. So the action that winds perform. So la provincia será barrida por vientos. The province will be swept by winds. The two verbs are also used to describe victories, right? Especially sort of very resounding victories. And I'll start with English. So when Silence of the Lambs swept the Oscars, the only other movies to win all 5 major awards were this and that other movie. Okay, and again, perhaps it may seem a bit surprising, but given that sweep as a transitive verb only takes a location argument, not a locatum, even though you might think that the Oscars are something people pick up, we are going to take seriously the idea that somehow the Oscars are associated with a location. I'll explain this more shortly. In the case of barrer, we have an example like estaba dispuesta a barrer los oros. This describes something that this swimmer that you see here wanted to do some years ago. And I've put this color, which is a bit between blue and green, because one could wonder whether los oros is fulfilling the role of the location or the locatum, right? If it's fulfilling the location role, then the idea would be that this would be like sweep the Oscars. But since we know that barrer can take a locatum argument, perhaps in a sense, what this swimmer is doing is picking up or wanting to pick up the medals. I'll come back to this in a second, but the point is the figurative uses are conceptually quite similar. Now let's look at some differences, okay? And what's interesting about these differences is they don't have to do with differences of domain, of general kind of conceptual areas, but actually kind of very specific details that are not easy to see at first glance sometimes. So for example, with sweep, in relation to looking, it's possible for your eyes to sweep an area. His unfocused eyes swept the bar and settled on me. And possible when there's nothing specific that's being looked for, right? And according to Spanish speakers that I've talked to, this is not a way that you would use barrer. Normally you use barrer if there is an object of search that's somehow understood. So if that object is missing, you want to use a different verb, maybe escanear instead of barrer. Why is that? Right? A gentle breeze swept my face. Again, a use kind of in relation to, a bit similar to this wind example that we saw before. Here again, you would not use barrer to talk about el viento, la brisa barrió mi cara. Spanish speakers tell me that this is a very strange thing to say. Our suggestion would be that this is because with this kind of example, there's nothing in principle to be displaced or that could be picked up. If you have a storm, the storm is going to move all kinds of things, leaves, trees, what have you, right? With a breeze sweeping your face, this doesn't happen. So it seems that barrer cares that there's no, again, metaphorical object to be displaced, whereas sweep doesn't. We get examples of figurative uses with barrer that are not possible with sweep, or that are possible with sweep only in very limited contexts. And again, these are quite interesting because the domain is not really the problem. And I'd like to point out here that in some of these cases, what is crucial is that you have the locatum as the direct object. So, me puse la mano en el bolsillo y barrí algunas monedas. So I put my hand in my pocket, and what I would say is I dug out some coins. I could say I swept out some coins, but then my hand has to be sort of like this. I have to have a kind of planar motion. So sweep cares about this planar motion. And of course, if I were to say it, I would have to say swept out. Right? Or another example in relation to this domain of winning things, a very, very common use of barrer is to describe huge defeats in individual games. So El Madrid barrió al Maccabi en el Palacio, 79-53, right? So Madrid, I would say in English, wiped out Maccabi. I wouldn't say Madrid swept Maccabi. I wouldn't say they swept away Maccabi. Swept away is a bit odd. And again, I think the problem is that here you're treating Maccabi as the locatum, and there is no metaphorical planar motion of any kind. This is what sweep cares about. What is the difference? So we saw an example before, sweeping the Oscars, and here's another example. The Cardinals swept the Cubs. When you sweep in English and win, you have to have a set of things that you sweep. It seems to us that this set of things constitutes a kind of location. The location of those things, in some sense, metaphorically, constitutes a surface that sweep, the sweeping action, the winning can pass metaphorically over. So the idea is that the event structure, even in the case of the victory, could be a bit different, right? There are different ways that you can structure, that you can segment these events, with the specific consequence that in the case of barrer, you can describe a victory on a single occasion, whereas in the case of English, this is, at least not in American English, a possible thing to do. Okay, so now I want to talk, this is just a taste of the data, right? But I want to try to get some traction on the similarities and differences in these figurative uses and how we might explain them. And we're going to build on this very interesting work by Baudel and Gentner, what they call the career of metaphor theory of figurative language. So they have argued that metaphorical figurative meaning involves analogical structure mapping between domains. So the conceptual domain in this case that you might think is associated with that IDS concept of sweeping, literal sweeping, which we take to be shared by both verbs. This domain is analogically connected to other domains, searching, winning, the passing of weather, etc. And insofar as these, the core concept is similar in the two languages, this analogical mapping should be possible. And this facilitates the similarities in the figurative uses. But I think this career of metaphor is extremely interesting and important to kind of think a bit more about. So their idea is that when you do a sufficient number of these analogical mappings, and they're sufficiently varied, in fact, the verb or the word that is the sort of source of the metaphor of the figurative language changes meaning. It becomes more abstract. And in fact, there's good evidence that often the meaning becomes a kind of radial, describes a kind of radial category, as Lakoff described, and in very interesting work by Xu and Barbara Malta and some other colleagues, you see evidence of this in language change. All right, so figurative language then actually changes some of what we can mean with language for ourselves. The fact that these analogical extensions change ends up changing the way that we can categorize. And if this happens again and again over time, and the paths in which this happen are somewhat varied, well, really the way that the meaning can be used for, the language can be used for us to categorize can become quite different. Now, I think something that's important to emphasize is that the categories themselves, as I said, I think there's very strong evidence that they are not discrete, right? The thing that is out there in our model, well, in our minds, let's say, this thing is not discrete. The signal itself is discrete. The fact that we use sweep and we indicate that we think sweep should somehow simultaneously categorize an action with a broom and a victory. This signal is discrete, but the category itself, I think there's strong evidence that it's not. And I think this kind of simultaneously we've got something discrete, but simultaneously we have something non-discrete. It creates a kind of I don't know, uncomfortableness or difficulty in the analysis of meaning. And here I would just like to say that this difference in discreteness between the signal itself and the object that is signaled by it was brought to my attention in work by Sebastian Lübner in talking about categorization and language. Now, formal semanticists have focused on the discrete, right? Cognitive semanticists generally have focused on the non-discrete, but here I think we really have to follow the cognitive semanticist lead. That is, if we want a theory of language, a theory of meaning to include a theory of language change and meaning change. And so if we want to model semantic change and its downstream effects, we have to take the non-discrete, we have to be able to model it, we have to take that very seriously. All right. Now, what about the differences, right? When we use verbs, and I think this is something that is maybe easy to forget, when we use verbs, we always use them in a given morphosyntax. We don't just say sweep, or we don't just say barrer by themselves. The syntax comes with it. And many formal and cognitive semanticists agree that this morphosyntax signals some kind of bare bones features of the described event. This is what I'm calling event structure. And you see this, as I said, in both kinds of perspectives, and there are different ways to think about this event structure signal. What is this? Some people, especially in the formal tradition, think of it as eventive lexical entailments, things like cause or become in capital letters or with a prime, which combine somehow with idiosyncratic lexical entailments. You see this both in Levine and Rappaport's work, you see it in Beavers and Kunz-Garboden's work, you see it in many places. You also see in the cognitive literature the idea that this bare bones is somehow a very abstract Fillmorian frame, which can combine with more specific frames. This is suggested in this 2010 paper by Adele Goldberg. There's another way to think about this bare bones signal, which I first learned about in the work of James Pustejovsky, and which is interestingly different. And it is to think of discrete reference to segments of myriotopologically structured events. So not think about event structure as information that's like other information that you have, whether that is considered a kind of Fillmorian concept or a lexical entailment, but to really think of the morphosyntax as signaling this part of an event, that part of an event, and to tell you how to actually refer to the pieces of the events which when I call them myriotopologically structured, I mean that they in and of themselves can be heterogeneous. So Pustejovsky's event structures consist of states and actions. Sometimes the actions precede the states and they form more complex structures, more complex kinds of events. This perspective, I think, is extremely important and worth thinking about, and to really think about the fact that it is different from these other ways of thinking about event structure. It took me an extremely long time to appreciate this, but I think it's important for many reasons, one of which has to do with some things that I have seen also in the language acquisition literature. So Kathy Hirsch-Pasek and Roberta Golenkoff have spent decades looking at verb meaning and how verbs are learned by very small children. And they point out, and these are bullet points really taken from a recent talk that I heard Roberta Golenkoff give. So they point out that coordinating on event segmentation is crucial for mutual understanding, right? You need to know when you're jumping what a jump actually consists in, right? And how is that different from a hop? How is that different from a series of hops? And they argue that humans, even very small babies, segment and in this way discretize events. Events in the wild are not discrete, but we discretize them using, they claim, both top-down conceptual cues, general goals and intentions we can identify, but also bottom-up perceptual cues, manner and path, the kind of stuff that is the bread and butter of event structure, right? And there is more than one way to segment a given event. This is crucial. If you spend some time looking at videos of people doing anything, you can see this immediately. And languages guide us in learning how to do this. This is crucial. So the hypothesis is that what the morphosyntax offers us is cues to event segmentation by signaling how we should coordinate on event reference. All right. And this signal, and crucially the referent, the thing that the signal points us to, are both discrete. So the difference between kind of the conceptual content we were talking about earlier, the stuff of the domain of sweeping, the domain of Barrère, that stuff I claimed was not discrete, right? The categories are not discrete, or not necessarily discrete. Clearly, the segments that we make out of events are discrete. We discretize them. And so those are two very different kinds of meaning. And as such, it seems to me that they have to be treated, they have to be modeled a bit differently, right? Now, in the case of figurative language, thinking about event segmentation and the fact that a verb that we're going to use figuratively comes with some syntax, so comes with some segmentation it's carrying along with it, there's no reason why that segmentation should be different depending on whether the verb is describing some situation, let's say, more literally or more figuratively. All events need to be segmented. And so it's not surprising that that morphosyntax isn't so malleable. Rather, we segment the situations that we find following the segmentation cues that come with the verbs that we use, right? If then the morphosyntax of sweep signals a different event segmentation from the morphosyntax for Barrère, these verbs are going to support different possible event categorizations according to the segmentations that they bring with them. And this also can have downstream effects in the way meaning will work, right? So what we have is a situation that you see with figurative language of classification of events happening according to two very different sorts of parameters. The kind of very general domain stuff that comes along with the concept, and that was the sort of stuff described by Baudel and Gettner, especially when thinking about noun meanings, but also the kind of categories that are constructed out of similarities in event segmentation, right? And these two work together, and they, I would argue, inform each other. I can't really describe how that happens in detail, but if you spend some time looking at the verb, you will see this. So now I want to talk about the implications of this view for theories of verb phrase meaning. Okay. So as I said at the very beginning, here I'm going to divide so theories of verb meaning not according to whether they are more cognitivist or more formal, but rather according to whether they are more uniform or less uniform in their assumptions about meaning. So a uniform theory on this view treats all of the meaning associated with a verb phrase as fundamentally of the same type, differing basically in specificity. And again, to return to this work by Goldberg, her proposal in this paper is an example of this view. So she says, as I quoted before, that verbs contribute a semantic frame of predication, a generalized, possibly complex event or state that constitutes a cultural unit, whereas argument structure constructions designate general, very abstract semantic frames, things like X causes Y to receive Z. A formalist version of a uniform theory you can find in Beavers and Koons-Garboden's recent book, where they argue that templates, which are essentially contributed by morphosyntax, template and root meanings differ not ontologically, but in specificity, with roots sometimes including template meaning, but not conversely, because of course the roots are more specific. Template meanings consist of general eventive lexical entailments, these things like cause and become, whereas root meanings include idiosyncratic lexical entailments. So they do not include in their idea of idiosyncratic lexical meaning all of this other kind of rich lexical stuff that is not necessarily entailed, but that in fact sometimes does contribute to figurative language use. So these are uniform theories. But not all visions of meaning are uniform. So you can find in the literature suggestions, if not really well-developed theories, that suggest that meaning doesn't need to be and shouldn't be uniform. So for example, in a recent paper by Malka Rappaport-Hovav, which builds on many years of work with Beth Levine, she observes that roots are the kind of content stuff, let's say, that we associate with verbs, are inherently categorized with grammatically relevant ontological features. So this is the stuff that morphosyntax brings along, cause, change, etc., which serve as the interface between full conceptual content and grammar. So the fact that she distinguishes something like full conceptual content and grammar is a move in the direction of what I would call a non-uniform theory of meaning. And it's interesting to note that I think for her, even though she and Beth Levine have a very specific theory of what this grammatically relevant ontological feature set looks like, I think it's almost more important to her that you could have, that this kind of meaning even exists at all, something that's grammatically relevant versus not. And there are alternatives to cause and change and so forth that are conceivable. And for some ideas in this respect, I would point you to this book that Alexander Williams published several years ago about argument structure, which is very interesting. Another example you find in actually two very disparate, kind of curiously disparate pieces of work. So Hagit Borer's work on the one hand, and Robin Karsten's a recent paper that she has written, where they both say that verbs and other content words are built out of categoryless roots plus morphosyntax. And interestingly, they say that the root in the absence of morphosyntax has no meaning, even though roots of polysemous words are shared. So the fact that they say roots have no meaning is maybe kind of a puzzling thing that it would be interesting to spend some time talking about. I could, again, give some thoughts on that in the question period. I can't elaborate on it now. But I think it's interesting that on the one hand, they separate out the contribution of the root, and it must contribute something because it's shared across polysemes by hypothesis, as opposed to what you get once you incorporate morphosyntax, right? And then a very sort of specific proposal for a non-uniform meaning appears in this paper that I published last year with Berit Gerka on partially compositional idioms, which is sort of a first attempt to develop in some detail this general idea that I'm trying to get you interested in here. But I will not try to get into the details of that because they're just far too complex for the time I have. So kind of getting towards the end of this part of the talk, I cannot offer any knockdown evidence that a uniform theory cannot account for polysemy data. Uniform theories always have an appeal, it seems. People like things to be all, of the same sort. They might seem simpler. There are other reasons that we might want to have a uniform theory of meaning. But I think that both the cognitive and referentialist variants of uniform theories have a certain cost. And I'd like you to at least think about this cost. If you want to hold on to the uniform theory, you have to think about the costs. On the cognitivist side, we don't really get, or I haven't seen yet, any explanation that's really clear and convincing of how we manage to converge on similar event segmentations as speakers of a language. The closest thing I've seen to this is the idea of the meeting of minds that Peter Gegenfors has developed in various pieces of work within a sort of cognitivist theory. But this is really crucial, especially since event segmentation varies from language to language. It's not guaranteed to be the same for everyone. On the referentialist side, the referentialist variants of these uniform theories really don't have much to say about polysemy or concept composition, and that's been a problem from the very beginning. It's been the problem that I have most suffered in trying to deal with using these sorts of frameworks. And neither variant offers an insight into something that I think is highly unappreciated about language, but is something that I've certainly experienced myself living in an environment where I don't, where I'm habitually speaking more than one language, which is that you can often think you understand someone until suddenly you realize you don't understand something at a very deep level. So I've been speaking Spanish for 25 years, and it was only when I started to look very carefully at these polysemy data that I realized that there were many things that I didn't actually understand about the Spanish language. And this is kind of the effect that, you might be very happy to say, sweep barrer, yeah, sure, it's the same, until you hear someone say that Lady Gaga swept in. And with barrer, you could never in a million years describe this kind of situation. And so that's something that we should have an explanation for. How can we think that we're understanding each other sometimes when then these very strange differences emerge, which are in fact telling us about event segmentation, but maybe we're just not paying much attention to, especially if it's not coming from our first language. So thinking broadly about why and for whom and how we signal meaning, so that some of it helps us categorize, some of it is for ourselves, but we have to be able to coordinate on that. We have to make it clear to others how the categories connect to things in the world that other people have access to. I think thinking in this very general sense takes away some of the abstract appeal of uniform theories. And in addition, I think there are other indicators that this linguistic signal isn't necessarily uniform. And you find these in various places in various kinds of literature. So I'll start with the syntax semantics interface literature. Especially in the syntax literature, you find very specific proposals for things that, at least for someone with my very old-fashioned training in syntax, have sometimes provoked considerable puzzlement. So, for example, Peter Svenonius's banyan trees, which he used to analyze idioms, these are trees that have this kind of multi-dominance structure, right? Where you have a verb and a noun as sister to each other, and at the same time, there's another tree which has the noun as a sister to a determiner. What is that, right? Of course, it forms a part of his understanding of how an idiom, a partially compositional idiom, works. A similar proposal, different in detail, involves the idea that you do a low merge of V and N and merge D higher up, which you can find in Dominique Sportich's work and also in more recent work by Carlo Cecchetto and Caterina Donati. Coming from training in which I always thought that a noun and a determiner formed a constituent, I found this very puzzling. But then you go to the sort of semantics literature and you find partial reconstruction. So Uli Sauerland has argued that after you quantify or raise, a quantificational noun phrase, when you interpret, you need to take the descriptive content, everything but the quantifier, and put it back down next to the verb and interpret it next to the verb, right? You find in HPSG, in the work of Manfred Seiler, perhaps unsurprisingly, another person who's been very concerned with partially compositional idioms, the idea that you have local content that you have to compute, and you have compositional semantic content, which you have to compute. And local content is really about verbs selecting for nouns and this kind of thing. So content words interacting with each other. All of these are examples of syntactic solutions to get at the problem that on the one hand, content words are interacting with each other, and there's syntax helping us do that. On the other hand, the content words have to interact with the function words, and we need syntax to do that. Another example, in the incorporation literature, Farkas and de Swart's proposal that you have two kinds of variables in discourse representation theory: thematic variables that put verbs and their arguments together, connect descriptive contents, versus discourse reference, which you need for everything that is related to reference in anaphora. So very specific proposals, all of which are kind of struggling with the same sort of problem. A very different sort of example of a reason to think that maybe there is something to non-uniformity in this linguistic signal is the debate over what constitutes the head of a phrase. It used to be that the verb or the noun was the head of the noun phrase or the verb phrase. Then D or inful or tense became the head of the noun phrase or the verb phrase or the DP or the IP. Bruning has argued that no, in fact, it really should be the end that's the head of the noun phrase. So again, this reflects a struggle of, concerning what part of the information should be controlling what's happening elsewhere in the syntax. Is it the content, the conceptual part, or is it something more related to reference? And finally, something that I only started to think about at sort of the end of having begun to develop this way of thinking about meaning is the fact that you have an entire framework which posits two separate syntactic structures, which is lexical functional grammar. You have functional structure, which does many things. In fact, it actually drives all of the semantics of LFG. So they haven't really used these two structures for two different kinds of semantics, but you have the functional structure whose initial job was to put together verbs and arguments. And then you have constituent structure, which manages everything else, right? So, if you have a framework in which you have two kinds of syntactic structures, it doesn't seem so unreasonable to think that there might be distinct kinds of meaning composition related to each of them. But it's not just in the linguistics literature that we find reasons to think there might be non-uniformity in semantics. You find this in the natural language processing literature as well. Just a few disparate examples. Again, I cannot go into details, but I encourage you to look at this literature. First, you get better results in parsing with a mix of dependency and constituent structure parses, it seems, already in work that goes back to the early 2000s. But my understanding from work that I've seen more recently is that this seems to be the case. The two mutually feed each other, right? This suggests that it's not that there's simply two different ways of looking at language data, but that there's something complementary that they're capturing. You also see it, I think, in the growth of what people call sometimes rich type theories or modern type theories, ideas that come from Martin Löw type theory, alongside classical logical model theoretic semantics. You see this in the work of Nicholas Asher, of Robin Cooper and his colleagues, people that are doing type theory with records. So some of this work, especially Nicholas Asher's, went to the rich type theory literature to try to find better ways to deal with lexical semantics. And so the solution has clearly been to come up with two different representation languages. So again, we might think maybe each of these is doing something different on the meaning side. And finally, much more recently in the computational semantics literature, you find non-symbolic computational semantic models, which can be compositional. which look very much like concept representations. Again, giving complementary information to that provided by classic symbolic models, right? Each of these have strengths and weaknesses. You see this in Lewis and Steedman's work. You see it in a recent thesis by Guy Emerson and work he's done with Anne Kopstake. So this complementarity is clearly evident in the natural language processing literature. And it's also, I think, visible in philosophy of language. This literature I don't know as well, but you can see it, for example, in Guillermo del Pinal's dual content theory of meaning. So to close, and I'm really very much near the end, I want to say a bit about this kind of broader semiotic perspective. So I hope that it's not too controversial that linguistic signal allows us to create complex categories, to classify individuals and events, to relate those individuals and events in complex ways, and to share all of this with other people. Right? Language is doing all of this. Some for ourselves, it's structuring our world. It's allowing us to share that world, that structure with others. But as I've said various times, many theories of meaning construction assume that the building blocks of linguistic meaning should somehow be uniform, either in the world, entirely in the world. So stuff that's not connectable directly to the world is not the job of the linguistic semanticist, or somehow entirely in our minds. And then the meeting of the minds is maybe a limited concern. But if you think about signaling much more generally, think about signaling in domains that don't have anything to do with human language, I don't see any a priori reason why a signaling system, including human language, should have to make, why should we have to make do with unnecessarily limited signaling resources? I don't see the a priori reason why that should be. And in fact, if you think about it more generally, a non-uniform signal that supports both reference-free inference, that is, allows us to just take content words and try to figure out what's coming from those, and reference-only inference that allows us to take the kind of pointing signals, that determiners, that deixis, that morphosyntax of different kinds affords us, to use those in parallel, that actually is a very robust kind of system. When one fails, you work with the other. If you can put the two together, you've got a more powerful, a more robust, a more helpful signal. I think, even though I have not had time to discuss it in any detail, that the verb polysemy data suggests that the linguistic signal is in fact non-uniform. Part of it discretely signals reference, event segmentation. Part of it discretely signals categories that are not discrete but must be productively creatable, right? So the verb signal is doing this, and probably noun, you can find similar evidence in other parts of the grammar, but I think it's especially easy to see in verbs. So thinking about meaning in this more articulated way, I think can give us a fresh way to attack Partey's challenge, to turn her hope into a reality. And I hope that I will have at least convinced you that this is an idea that's worth thinking about. Thanks, and I will stop here.
Thank you very much for this talk. It was wonderful. I have one question from Anna Clara Polakov, and she's asking, could you argue that a referentialist could deal with polysemy and figurative meaning by introducing implicatures a la Grace? Wouldn't this solve the problem?
Using implicatures.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you the way that, first I will talk about the way people have typically dealt with polysemy in referentialist perspectives. One way has been to adopt what has been called a kind of indexical theory of meaning. So this, probably the earliest champion of this was Peter Bosch, where the idea was that what came with the word was a function from context to content. And so in a sense, all of the hard work of figuring out how the meaning actually ended up concretized in context, that came from the context. It didn't come in the language. Sometimes this is done using very contextual variables. It's not that those kind of approaches are falsifiable. I don't think that they are. What they are is they're incomplete. They leave the hard part of the problem unsolved, which is what is that pragmatic part? How does it work? What is it that makes us make similar sorts of mappings, and why we make those mappings and not others, right? My feeling, and this is not really an empirical question. This is a matter of like what you want your field to be able to do, right? So I've been working in semantics, basically formal semantics, for 30 years, and I've been extremely convinced by the things that I've learned from referentialist semantics. I learned enormous things, and I would not throw a single one of those things away. But it's also true that there is a large community of people to whom referential semantics offers very little. And what I have seen, both looking at the literature in cognitive neuroscience and also looking at the literature, especially in natural language processing, is that since that literature does not speak to these other problems, how do we make categories? How does the content part of the linguistic signal work? Those fields are moving on, and they're not picking up all the other stuff that referentialist semantic theory has given us. And I think that is a very, very sad and counterproductive kind of state of affairs. So this is my main concern. Could implicature help? Sure, I guess you actually, this would be a whole other talk. I think especially the idea in rational speech act theory and these kind of more recent Bayesian approaches to meaning, where a lot of the information we get out of language out of utterances is driven by considering alternatives that could have been said, right? I think this is one way in which we could make a theory of polysemy much more interesting, but I can't really develop that in the time I have to answer questions. So I guess the short answer to Anna's question is, well, yes, it could help some, but I think the important thing is we're not here to save referential semantics and to kind of, see if it can do on its own, something that is a much bigger enterprise, but rather, let's take referential semantics and put it together with something that will make it much more useful to a much wider audience.
Hi, Anna. Anna, can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm back now. There is another question from Jean Diogo. Thank you for the talk, and he asked about It's not a question really. He wants to listen a little more about the approaches adopted on those non-symbolic computational semantic models mentioned in your talk.
Okay, so most of these models are in some sense outgrowths of what is sometimes called distributional semantics. So they have their origins in work of Zellick-Harris and work of Firth from the 1950s. And the idea is that you can learn a lot about a word meaning by looking at the distribution of that word in context, right? And these systems have evolved quite a bit, especially in recent years as artificial intelligence has been evolving. But very, very simply, the idea is that you represent the word meaning as a kind of giant vector that reflects all of the uses that this word has in a text. Sometimes you can narrow that text, you can focus on certain limited context size, you can add sometimes a bit of syntactic information to narrow it down, but really the idea is that for example, your representation of sweep will reflect the fact that some number of times that is large, sweep will appear with broom, and it will probably never appear or rarely appear with hammer, right? And this kind of thing. And what's interesting about these approaches is that they take what I call the kind of yarn ball approach, or you can think of it as the overspecification approach to word meaning. So you have this very large and non-diffuse way of representing what the meaning is, and you can take a similar representation for example, your direct object. So the floor versus the Oscars. And those individual words will also have a similar sort of representation. And then what happens in composition is that essentially you have a kind of filtering effect. So the similarities between the floor and sweeping will be strengthened. The things that they share will be strengthened in composition. The things that they don't share will be weakened. The same thing will happen if you combine sweep with the Oscars. And in that sense, you get a kind of disambiguating effect on the verb. So it's kind of looking at the problem of disambiguation as strengthening those things that different words have in common and weakening those that they don't. Whereas in kind of the classic formal semantics way, you would look for that minimum thing that all uses have in common, which in fact, George Lakoff has argued, I think, quite persuasively, that that single thing is almost impossible to find and many times doesn't exist. So then your problem of identifying that, is already severe. And then then what you have to do is figure out how to fill that in with whatever comes from the rest of your context, which was Pustoyevsky's idea behind co-composition. But that is very, very challenging to do, whereas this kind of filtering approach is very easy to, or reasonably easy to model computationally. And there's actually some psycholinguistic evidence for something like this. There's a very interesting recent paper by Lotte Hoogeweg in the Journal of Semantics, where she talks about some kind of evidence from adjectival modification of nouns for this overspecification sort of representation. So I hope that gives you an idea.
Thank you very much. I have a question now from Violeta De Monte, and she says, in the same line as the last question from Polakov about how to model a non-uniform account, does the broad semiotic approach imply that in a way there is no limit for creation of figurative meanings?
Well, first let me say un saludo y un abrazo muy grande a Violeta. I'm very happy to hear from you. And I was very happy to see your talk also. So limits, I think the limits are much less than people think. And here's the interesting thing. I think linguists don't like to think that there are no limits, but idioms are the interesting thing to look at. So if you look at partially compositional idioms and idioms that are not compositional at all, and actually idioms that are completely non-compositional are not too easy to find. So everybody likes the example of kick the bucket, but in fact you find kick buckets, buckets were kicked. I mean, you do find these examples. But one example that I like to give is shoot the breeze, which means kind of to talk idly. And if you ask yourself, what is it about shoot the breeze that led it to come to be used to describe talking idly? The only thing that I can think about, I mean, I don't know where exactly this idiom came from, but the thing that occurs to me is that they're two kind of pointless things, right? So the analogy in a sense is the pointlessness of shooting the breeze, you know, kind of the pointlessness or non-goal directedness of the conversation. And if you think about the structure of those events, shooting, you know, a gun into the air and talking, actually, especially they have very little in common, right? They're not so common. And it seems to me that that must have something to do with the fact that when you use shoot the breeze, the syntax ceases to be active. You lose, unless you can find a way to map the breeze and the shooting onto some sort of participants in a conversation situation, there's nothing for the syntax to do. It's not going to serve for event segmentation. And when you look at partially compositional idioms, typically what they can do is afford that kind of mapping. So I would say we have to have fairly weak predictions about what can happen. We can expect almost anything to happen, but what we should expect is that the less the figurative use has to do with or is related to event structure, the less active the syntax should be. So.
Well, there are many congratulations and thanks for the wonderful talk. I will use this time to ask a question to learn a little more. So what kind of phenomena is going to help us to go in this direction, in this path? So what should we look at? Idioms, of course, and you gave a lot of examples in the verb aspect and other domains, but what kind of data in language would help us to try to bridge cognitive semantics and formal semantics?
Well, this is an excellent question. So thank you for asking it. I think that modification is very important. I think the fact that I have somehow been worrying about modification for a long time has been a large part of what has gotten me to where I am now on this topic. I think that cross-linguistic comparison and contrast is extremely important. So actually, my earliest history with this problem, with this kind of general area, came from looking at differences in reflexive psychological verbs in Spanish and English, and being told by Rafael Marin that reflexive psychological verbs in Spanish, things like what people sometimes call inchoative verbs, like what I would say in English, to get angry or to fall in love, that these were stative. And I thought, this guy is crazy. How can these be stative, right? And it was only after really looking in a lot of detail at the internal logic of the two languages that I could understand that. So, you know, it's really kind of the detail work, not just kind of superficial comparison of this word here and this word there. I think getting into kind of the internal logic of the linguistic system is very important. You cannot set syntax aside. Another thing that I think is very helpful is learning to be comfortable with different kinds of tools. So in formal semantics, you know, we learned the tools of first, second order predicate logic, model theory. These are super helpful. But once we added other tools, you know, lattice theory, that helped us get an understanding of aspect. Now there's myriotopological theories. This is helping us understand better plurals and things that we had trouble analyzing just with what we had before. So, and now I think these tools from computational semantics, you know, you have to learn how not to be afraid of them. You have to learn to accept what they can do and what they can't do. I think the most important thing is to be open to what they can do and what they can't do. Other data areas, I think thinking about, not only thinking about figurative meaning, but thinking about figurative meaning in a kind of parceled out way. So metonymy and what people call coercion is often kind of lumped together with figurative language use, metaphor, metonymy. You hear those two words together, but to me, they look like very different phenomena, because metonymy is very much connected to reference, substituting one referent for another, whereas metaphor is really about substituting, adapting one description to another kind of entity, right? And learning to think about those two things as separate, I think, is also very helpful. But I think any piece of data where you look at a content word together with some piece of grammar is going to give you something to think about.
Okay, and since we have a little more time, I would like to ask you, what is your personal view of affability and universals and differences between languages?
So I would say that in principle, I see no reason why we can't say anything in any language. We can try, right? So in that sense, I would not subscribe, let's say, to a kind of strong version of something like a Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. However, I will say the following. I do think that the fact that we make categories, you know, that we use language to structure the world for ourselves, introduces very strong biases in the way that we think. These biases can be overcome, right? But we're often not aware of how biased we are by our own language. And to me, the best example of this, and maybe it's controversial, I hope it's controversial, is actually the language of research. Theoretical language is one of the worst examples of how you take on a kind of way of thinking about things, and it can be very hard to step outside of that, especially, you know, I mean, in my case, my first, let's say, theoretical language was, you know, the language of formal semantics. I have a great love for it. I continue to use it, but there were things that I didn't see because I was only thinking in those terms. Or the language that, you know, the language of classic syntax, you learn about NV, adjective and adverb. You don't think about the heterogeneity that there is in the domain of adverbs. You don't think that, you know, that all of categorization in syntax is an example, I think, of how, you know, affability, I think, you can express almost whatever you want. The thing is to be careful that you don't want to forget that the language that you're using to express anything is a language, and somebody else may have another perspective because they're using a different language.
I think Anna has a problem with her connection, so let me
Okay, thank you very much. I had some problems with the internet, but thank you for your very good answer. And everybody is saying that the talking was wonderful. I think we
Sorry, I think that the connection went off again. So thank you very much, Louise, for your collaboration. Do you want to say some final words?
Just to thank all of you again for your tremendous effort. And I am looking forward to the rest of the series and to go back and look at the talks that I haven't been able to see yet. And I wish especially all of you lots of health and success in dealing with the pandemic.
Thank you very much.
Okay, take care. Bye.